Hi everyone and welcome to today's Biology Daily Booster. This is number 8 in our paper 2 series and it is advanced information listed for those of you doing higher tier biology. What we're going to be looking at now is the section which is 5.2 on the specification. So to start off with, we're going to have a little look at what we mean by the word evolution. Quite simply, when we talk about evolution, it's the gradual change in a species over time. So, for example, looking at how humans have changed through their earlier incarnations until we got to our present day humans. Those are gradual changes over a long period of time. So, how does it take place? Well, the answer is through natural selection. Now, natural selection is one of the kind of favourite topics, if you like, of GCSE exam papers for biology. And there are 5 key steps that you need to know. And there are certain phrases we're going to make sure we include in an answer on natural selection. First thing is variation. So we need to make a statement that says that in a species there is variation. You can get that same marking point by talking about mutations causing variations within the species. But first point has to be there is variation in the species. Second point is for saying that the organisms which are best adapted will survive. Now, we can generalise that as survival of the fittest, but quite frequently you're not getting a mark for survival of the fittest unless literally that's the only thing worthy of credit in your answer. So if you can't think of anything else to say, survival of the fittest, great, that should get you a mark. But if you do write something like there's variation within a population and then write survival of the fittest, you're not getting a mark for that second one. Okay, so the phrase to learn is the best adapted organisms will survive. Step 3, you're just talking about the fact they're surviving to the point of reproduction. So those that are best adapted survive so they can reproduce. You can put kind of steps 2 and 3 together into one sentence. So the best adapted organisms will survive and reproduce, which brings us on to step 4. What we need to say is they're going to pass on the allele for the advantageous characteristic. So what we're going to say here is that the advantageous allele is passed on to the offspring. Go careful with just sort of saying that the offspring get the characteristic. Try to use that phrase advantageous allele. And then the 5th and final one is that it repeats over many generations. So you've got to have the idea of this happening over and over again over a long period of time. Let's look at some examples where we see this natural selection in action. First one, the peppered moths. What we find is pre-industrial revolution, then the majority of peppered moths were actually the light coloured ones. And if we look at this top picture here, there are 2 moths on there. Hopefully we can pick out the dark one very easily, and the light coloured one is in that circle there. So we can see there the light coloured one was very well camouflaged on things like the trees at the time. However, post-industrial revolution, everything kind of got covered in soot and everything was just rather dirty. And at that point, we end up with a situation like picture 2. Light coloured moths really stood out, whereas the dark coloured ones actually camouflaged much better with their surroundings. As a result, birds ate more of the light coloured moths, and therefore the dark coloured ones became more common in those urban areas. Example number 2, antibiotic resistance in our bacteria. Hopefully we know that bacteria reproduce really rapidly. In some cases every 20 minutes they will reproduce. If we have a mutation that makes them resistant to antibiotics, then every time they reproduce, the offspring are going to also inherit that same feature because they reproduce, remember, through mitosis, and that means we are making genetically identical copies of the parent cell. So if the parent is resistant to antibiotics, all of the offspring will be too. How do we have evidence for this then? Well, what we can actually do is go back to the good old fossil record. What we find is that buried all over planet Earth, we have the remains of animals or plants that have become mineralized over time. That's what we mean by fossil, just mineralized remains of animals and plants. The deeper underground we go, the older the fossil is. So quite simply, what we do is when we discover fossils, we can work out roughly when they were living based on how deep underground they were, and then we can put together this little kind of pattern, if you like, of how these species have changed over time. Because when we collect all these fossils together and then put them as a collection, you can look and see what are the differences between this one and the next. And that's what the fossil record is, a key piece of evolution, because it shows those gradual changes over time. In terms of other things that the fossils have revealed, they've showed us that bacteria are in some of the oldest rocks and more complex organisms are more recent. So that gives us this idea that life actually evolved from bacteria initially before becoming more complex. We can also find plant fossils before animal fossils. So that gives us that idea that plants were needed before animals could actually evolve. One of the best examples of the fossil record that we've got is that of the horse. Now, you don't have to remember all these different horses and their years that they were around or anything like this. It's just to show you how this then builds up a picture of this whole sort of idea of natural selection leading to evolution. So if we have a look at the beginning, you can see this is the kind of shape of the horse's foot. So you can see that we actually used to have 4 toes there. And then if you look at the pictures as we go along, you can see they become 3 down to just the single hoof we know today. So we can see those gradual changes over time from the fossils that we've got. You can also see how the size of the horse has gradually changed over time, from the kind of 20 centimetre little pocket pony that was Eohippus to what we know today as our pretty large horses. We can also see this happening in real time with certain species. Bacteria, Atlantic tomcod, really useful for studying evolution because they've got really rapid rates of reproduction. That means that we can see this happening in a reasonable time frame. You won't see it with organisms like us as humans because we take ages to reproduce, and therefore any changes that are going to take place in a population will take a really long time. So you want something with very rapid rates of reproduction to be able to study evolution in a sensible time frame. Other things we can look at is looking at the actual biological molecules. So one of the key things we can do is compare the DNA. If we look at DNA sequences of different organisms, we can work out how similar or different they are. The more similar, the more closely related those organisms. Same thing with proteins and the sequences of the amino acids that are present. The more similar the sequence of amino acids in a protein, the more closely related that species will be. It is worth remembering at this point that if we have a species that is incapable of adapting to their new environment, then they will become extinct. And the depressing fact that we've got there, 99% of all species ever to have lived on planet Earth are now extinct. And perhaps more depressing, we're actually at a point in our human history where we're seeing a much faster rate of extinction than at any time we have recorded before. So in your lifetime, expect things to go extinct. Where did we actually get this whole idea of natural selection from then? Well, hopefully we know Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a scientist, he was a naturalist, British, and what he did back in 1831 was he got on board a boat called the HMS Beagle and he sailed around the Galapagos Islands. Now the Galapagos Islands just off the coast of South America. What he was actually doing at that time was he was making a lot of detailed observations and drawings and actually collecting samples as well. Particularly famous are his work on the finches. Now on each of the different islands of the Galapagos, he was studying what finches were present, and he looked at things like the shape of the beak. And when he looked at the island itself and what food those finches were eating, the shape of the beak suited the food source. So those that were on islands where the food supply was kind of small insects tended to have much longer, thinner beaks to be able to get them out of the gaps in the trees. whereas those where the food source was nuts tended to have kind of short, sharp beaks in order to break the nuts open. So this is what actually formed the basis of his theory of natural selection. He made all of those observations and then thought, what does this actually show? So he came up with this idea of natural selection, and that's what he then put together using his actual evidence from the observations. Someone that we don't generally remember is Alfred Russel Wallace. So this was a Welsh scientist who was actually working in Borneo at the same time that Darwin was looking at the Galapagos Islands. They both independently came up with the theory of natural selection leading to evolution. What Wallace actually did was he sent his ideas to Darwin for this idea of peer review, so getting another scientist to look over your work to obviously see if there are problems with it that need rectifying, etc., before publishing his own theory. Now, when Darwin read this work, he realised that their ideas were really similar, and so the pair of them presented their papers jointly. So rather than just being an individual scientist, they sort of said, you know what, we've come up with the same ideas here, we can present both our papers together to give even more weight to our actual findings, because we've got two different sets of evidence that both lead to the same conclusion. Darwin then went on to publish an entire book called On the Origin of Species, and the whole idea of that was, rather than just having these scientific papers that were only viewed by academics, this actually introduced his idea to non-scientists, the general public. Now, obviously, going back to 1859, wasn't exactly well received by all because it was quite controversial. You've got someone here saying, you know what, humans actually evolved from a common ancestor with monkeys. Now, that goes very much against what the church's teaching was, because in the Bible, obviously, God created Adam and Eve, and then all humans came from that point. So what we have is a discrepancy between the religious views of the mass population and our scientific views. So at the time, very controversial, led to a bit of mocking in the paper, as we can see from the picture of Darwin's head stuck on a monkey's body, etc. But we now widely accept his theory of natural selection leading to evolution, because we've got all of this evidence to support it. And that's the key thing to remember when we're looking at what leads to these changes in science. It's all about gathering evidence that then makes you kind of look at what we believe at that point and say, you know what, it doesn't fit. And at that point, we then need to think of a new explanation for the evidence we have. If there are bits in today's Daily Booster that you'd like to go back over, obviously there's the videos on the main channel you can use, your revision guides, and as always, I do recommend looking at the OCR papers to get a bit of a feel for the kind of questions. Don't forget to join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Booster.